We walked the Camino. From the ancient bridge over the river Neve, I looked south. A line of green farms rose up ahead of me, capped by the lofty, distant crests of the Pyrenees. It was a grueling day the first time, and I was 6 years younger then. I looked over at Encarnita, backpack on her shoulders. Was I embroiling her in an out-of-character venture? Would it exceed her capabilities, my capabilities? 5 weeks? 6? 7 weeks? Each day another 20 kilometers to complete. What were we undertaking, and what was the appeal? To answer those questions, to understand the lure of the Camino, you need to know its tradition, its history, and its geography. Only then can you comprehend the reasons that drive people today to walk this medieval path. The question, what is the Camino de Santiago, the road to St. James, requires an answer that contains both history and geography. The Camino is the path leading to the northwest corner of Spain, a path followed by men and women from time immemorial. Medieval pilgrims often walked as Christians in hope of reward or of a return to good health, sometimes as punishment, occasionally in outright awe. The Camino's origins, however, predate the birth of Christ, and the motives of today's walkers go well beyond the Christian faith. Later, I'll return to the history and to today's motives, but first, the geography. The Camino de Santiago is the network of paths leading to the burial site of the Apostle James in the city of Santiago de Compostela, in the northwest corner of the Iberian Peninsula. Our Camino, Encarnita's and my Camino, began in a small French town, Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, nestled in the northern foothills of the Pyrenees. Our route took us south over the Pyrenees into Spain and Navarre, and to Ernest Hemingway's city of Pamplona. From there, we followed a vector west across the north of Spain. At its far western end lies the ancient city of Santiago de Compostela. That was our Camino. For others, the Camino is the path that starts wherever they happen to be when they decide to undertake the pilgrimage. As one advances to Santiago, these individual paths converge to form common routes. There are routes commencing in many different corners of Spain. The English often came by sea across the Bay of Biscay and landing on the north coast of the Iberian Peninsula. The Italians traversed southern France, passing through Toulouse. The 800 kilometers of our Camino presented us with a landscape that changed every day. First, the vivid green slopes of the Pyrenees rose up in front of us, sometimes windy and wet, sometimes sunny and dry. A gradual descent took us through the narrow valleys of the southern foothills, busy with mixed farming. Next came the rolling vineyards of Navarre and La Rioja, periodically punctuated by hills and woods. For 2 weeks, we walked the flat Castilian meseta, with its extensive grain fields stretching in every direction to the far horizons. After León, we crossed mountains covered in heather and gorse before descending into the Bierzo. Climbing again, we reached Galicia, dotted with small farms and cattle. Its choppy green hills owed their color to the Atlantic breezes and ocean mist. Galicia, not surprisingly, is Celtic country, and its bagpipes are reminiscent of other better-known Celtic corners of Europe. It was a constantly changing landscape, a landscape offering gentle surprises to be savored as one walked. Encarnita has told me To know a land, one must first walk it from one end to the other. On foot for the entire day, one is granted a continuous opportunity to observe, and the myriad details of the surrounding lands remain imprinted on the mind. I want to spend a few minutes reviewing some ancient history. What has the Apostle James got to do with a city in northwestern Spain? Some medieval history. Why did hundreds of thousands of people who lacked credit cards and had no access to airplanes, undertake a very difficult journey to a remote corner of Europe? And some modern history. What has sparked today's revival of interest in the Camino? James was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. Following the crucifixion, James was dispatched to the Iberian Peninsula to bring its inhabitants into the Christian faith. His results were not great, and he was recalled to Jerusalem. There he was martyred. His body was shipped across the Mediterranean and up the Atlantic coast. He was buried in a cave on the shores of Galicia. A millennium passes. One night, a light glowing in a cave attracts a Christian hermit. He finds James' remains. A crypt is constructed, and over the centuries, churches of ever-increasing size are raised, culminating in today's cathedral. By this time, the reconquest of the peninsula from the Moors was well underway. In 852, with the tide of the battle going against the Christians, James, astride a giant white horse, appeared and put the Moors to flight. That performance earned him the name Santiago Matamoros, James the Moor Slayer. His appearance at key moments in subsequent battles conferred on him the role of patron saint of Spain. The origins of pilgrimages to Santiago are interesting. In pre-Christian times, the Celts, curious about the daily disappearance of the sun beyond the edge of the Western Sea, would walk to Land's End, to Finisterre. Medieval Christians walked for reasons of religious significance, to beg God's favor, or to atone for a church-adjudicated sin. In early Christian times, the Holy Land was the pilgrim's favored destination. The rise of the Muslim world and the failure of the second and subsequent Christian crusades created the need for a replacement destination. Bishop Elmireth, in 12th century Santiago, was fast off the mark and grabbed the opportunity. Santiago became the destination of choice. What was the medieval pilgrim facing when he set out for Santiago? The trip was not easy. The land boasted little population, no roads, and no bridges. The medieval pilgrim encountered bogs and bandits. Even the local feudal lords were not above exacting extortion from passing pilgrims. Disease and pestilence confronted the pilgrims, many of whom were ill before beginning their trip. The rulers of the kingdoms making up the Iberian Peninsula granted land and town charters to those prepared to serve the pilgrim trade. Monastic orders, especially in France, established hospitals for the pilgrims. Chapels and churches were raised, and towns created. For centuries, the pilgrim traffic was heavy, hundreds of thousands in some years, until a changing political and cultural Europe diluted the value of the pilgrimage and the traffic diminished. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the rise in importance of Rome combined to diminish the numbers going to Santiago. Romanticism, as far as Spain was concerned, led travelers south to the peninsula's Islamic heritage. During the Franco years, interest in the pilgrimage dried up entirely, and some years fewer than 100 pilgrims recorded their arrival in Santiago. The final decades of the 20th century have witnessed a keen revival of interest, with pilgrims from all over the world today walking the Camino de Santiago. Indeed, this year, 2010, a holy year, more than 200,000 pilgrims will present their credentials in Santiago in order to obtain their certificates. Today, to qualify as a bona fide pilgrim, one need walk only the final 100 kilometers. There's a well-worn path from a nearby road to the 100-kilometer marker just west of the town of Sarria. Farther away from Santiago, on the stretches more to the east, the walkers are fewer in numbers. Crossing the Pyrenees in the spring, for example, there might be only 40 to 50 pilgrims a day. From where do the pilgrims come? Spaniards are the most numerous, with the heaviest flow during the summer months. Germany, France, and Italy provide a significant share of the traffic. In addition to a surprisingly large number of Canadians, especially from Quebec, I've encountered walkers from Japan, from Australia, from Brazil and Argentina, from Ghana. My impression of the average age of pilgrims in the spring is closer to 60. Summer holidays bring that figure down dramatically. What is a day on the Camino like? Certainly a great deal of time is spent walking, but under what conditions? What is it that makes up the bits and pieces of the day? The first time, I averaged 25 kilometers a day. The second time, with Encarnita as my companion, the average was 17. That slower pace reflected a deliberate decision to allow more time for us to enjoy the history and the culture, especially the architectural riches, walked by so quickly the first time. The 7 cathedrals encountered on the Camino reveal the evolution of European architecture, from Romanesque to Baroque. The intricate spires of Burgos Cathedral are the crowning glory of Spanish Gothic architecture. The lofty vaults of León are ablaze with light that streams through magnificent stained glass windows. Awaiting the pilgrim at the end of his journey stands Santiago, its exquisite Romanesque Portico de la Gloria, incorporating in its stone carvings more than 200 biblical figures. Often it is not the grand monuments that draw the attention. The origins of the octagonal chapels found at Unate and Torres del Rio are uncertain but likely attributable to the Knights Templar. These chapels possess a mysterious appeal. In one, we found a Spanish photographer studying the light as he prepared for the wedding of his nephew, who was marrying an American girl that the nephew had met on the Camino. In the other, we settled back against the columns when we realized the small group of people inside were an a cappella choir testing the acoustics and rehearsing in preparation for a recital. I could admire for days the Romanesque church of San Martin in Fromista. Simple in design and unadorned, the church manages to incorporate lines, angles, and curves that break what would otherwise be an austere form into a desert of delights. It's easy to trace the history of the peninsula through its architecture. To the east of León, just outside the town of Mansilla de las Mulas, stands the Mozarabic church of San Miguel de Escalada, built in the 10th century just after the Christians had recovered the territory from the Moors. Since the only artisans available had been trained to erect buildings in the Moorish style, you find this delightful church raised entirely on Arab horseshoe arches. Not all the architectural inventory comes from the distant past. That early 20th century Catalonian master, Antonio Gaudí, created 2 major works on the Camino, the Bishop's Palace in Astorga and the Casa Botín in León. Once inside the quirky Gaudí exterior, the interplay of arches, vaults, and light creates a cathedral in miniature. Whatever one sees and whatever the pace, the days share a common pattern. We would break the back of the day's walking before a late lunch, although we were prepared to settle for beer and tapas, and we would have a good dinner later in the day. Finding worthy places to eat was never a problem. Even a cluster of as few as 3 or 4 houses in Spain will contain at least one cafe or bar. We targeted our sleeping place before the day began. Every town and city along the Camino has at least one hostel. Some are municipal, some are private. Some community hostels can sleep as many as 50 or 80 people, sometimes all in one room. Large or small, all have excellent facilities for personal cleansing and washing clothes. Private hostels come in all sizes and shapes. Some even offer rooms for 2 with a private shower. The hostels almost always will have cooking facilities, so pilgrims can join forces and prepare their own meals. There are alternatives to the hostels. Very early on in our Camino, Encarnita stated her preference for privacy at night, and we had no trouble finding small hotels and bed and breakfasts. In 2003, I used a hostel for 3 nights out of 4 and slept the 4th night in a hotel. Some of the hotels are magnificent. Establishments such as the 5-star Hostel de San Marcos in León, a palace that once housed the ruler of a large part of Spain, and the Hostel of the Catholic Kings in Santiago, which has provided accommodation to pilgrims since the early Middle Ages. Wherever one decides to stay, however, somewhere between the end of the walking day and sleep at night, one finds the time to wash clothes, write a diary, and communicate with family back home. Hotels are more comfortable, but hostels are the best way to get to know your fellow walkers. The evening meal provides an opportunity to engage in deeper conversation with those undertaking the same journey as yours. You come to know them better, including their snoring habits. Apart from walking, eating, and talking, one watches the scenery unfold. Opportunities for photography are continuous, and you have all the time in the world to indulge. The walker's understanding of the history of the country and of Europe builds as one observes the towns, visits the churches, and surveys the monuments. What was it that caused the 100 or so people with whom I talked and the hundreds more whom I saw walking to undertake their voyage on the Camino? I found there were many reasons, and most of the pilgrims I met were there because of a mixture of those reasons. I found few devout Christians who were driven solely by the strength of their faith. Perhaps the Christian tradition of the Camino held the strongest appeal for the many pilgrims from Korea. Each pilgrim was an individual. What about Mary Luth from Holland? After caring day in and day out for 20 years for a severely handicapped son, she and her husband had been forced to institutionalize the young man. To reorient her life, she had walked all the way from Le Puy-en-Velay in the French Massif Central to Santiago in Spain. She was not alone in coming to terms with herself. Rob had recently lost his wife of many years, was walking the Camino again and serving as a volunteer in a hospice. John, a fellow Ontarian and recent beneficiary of heart bypass surgery, was walking to reorient his view of life. The Camino de Santiago is a treasure chest of history, of art, of stories. These riches were the strongest force behind my Camino. On the Camino you encounter one of Europe's most fascinating histories. The movement of peoples across the peninsula over the centuries has been continuous, and each has left its legacy. Celts, Phoenicians, Romans, Jews, Visigoths, Muslims, Christians. The histories and the legends are endless. The romances and tragedies of knights and kings abound. You encounter all the fundamental building blocks of European architecture as you view Romanesque, Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque structures. León, a city so important to the Reconquest, is not only home to the Basilica of San Isidro, with some of the best preserved Romanesque frescoes in Europe, and to a Gothic cathedral ablaze with light filtered by stained glass windows. Leon has also converted the Baroque palace of its chief constable into a five-star hotel. Some pilgrims are drawn to the Camino by its physical challenge. Walking day in and day out imposes a demanding discipline. Two Dutchmen in their 40s, lean, tanned, and gaunt, were covering the ground at the rate of 40 clicks a day. Unfortunately, I cannot give you their names, as we were not with them long enough to find out. There are those seeking conversation and companionship. Pilgrims talk. They talk about themselves. They talk while walking, and they talk during the evenings. They share stories, hopes, and fears with fellow walkers, and with individuals who live alongside the Camino. Inhibitions and reservations vanish. Every week on the Camino, you make fast friends. Some of those friendships evaporate the next day, others you retain for the rest of your lives. Encarnita and I have come to know Roger, an English astrophysicist, and our families have spent time together. Frank and I worked together for 35 years. 2 months walking built a much stronger relationship. And sometimes it's not just conversation that pilgrims are seeking. I remember Emilio, an opportunistic Spanish television talking head, who applied himself diligently every day to picking up attractive female pilgrims. Seeing him seated at a table with a young Brazilian woman, as I passed by, I could not resist asking how his more permanent girlfriend Victoria was doing. And there are the genuine characters. I encountered Angelo, a second-generation Greek, born 65 years earlier in Quebec City, but resident for decades in California, as he pushed a bicycle up a steep grade. He had begun his Camino much farther back than us, in Paris in fact. After several weeks on foot, he concluded he would never get to Santiago walking. Passing a young woman in a small French town, he bought her bicycle. He dumped his backpack into the bicycle's basket. From then on, he was pushing up hills and coasting down. We saw him again in Santiago, just after he had shipped the bicycle back to its owner. After a conference, one is often asked, "What did you take away from it?" So you might ask me, what did I bring away from my time on the Camino? First, I arrived in Santiago very happy and excited, both times. Weeks spent walking on open trails, under clear skies, breathing the freshest of air, leave the pilgrim feeling physically wonderful. Uncomplicated days, free from normal routine, across a landscape dotted with cultural treasures, works wonders on my mental makeup. Secondly, I enjoyed the opportunity of opening and exploring honest relationships. The barriers that so often impede and inhibit interaction do not exist on the Camino. The origins and makeup of the people you meet are so different from those you find on a non-Camino day. Some possess stories we remember, others become friends we value. It may be peculiar to me, but I am always on the lookout for coincidences. The 6 degrees separating individuals, wherever located on this globe, magically boil down to 2 or 3 on the Camino. An example, sitting in Burgos Cathedral, admiring its beautifully carved wooden choir stalls, I feel a hand on my elbow. It is Encarnita's nephew, who lives in the city of Granada, 600 kilometers to the south. He was setting out on a vacation in the north of France. Our paths shared that tiny intersection in space for no more than 15 minutes. Another example. 2 German pilgrims sat down at our table in a rural restaurant in Galicia. The next-door neighbor of one in Germany was a retired University of Toronto professor who had been one of Encarnita's doctoral program directors. They are now back in contact. Walking the Camino brings to life for me many important chapters of European history. Is there any better way of coming to grips with the tradition of Europe than by encountering it day after day in simple settings? The stories that make up European history become your stories when you find your feet on the ground where they played out. Finally, the pilgrim gains an improved perspective on one's place on this globe as he passes a steady stream of reminders of human endeavors from past centuries. The pilgrim realizes he's only a dot slowly moving across a vast landscape, following the ribbon of a trail that stretches forward to a far distant horizon under a never-ending sky.